Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kelley Dennings, and I'm a senior campaigner with the Center for Biological Diversity. The Center is a national, nonprofit conservation organization that works through a combination of science, law, policy, community organizing, and creative media to protect wildlife in the wild places they need to thrive. I personally work to develop and execute advocacy and outreach initiatives that address the connection between gender equity, endless growth, and the climate and extinction crises. I have a bachelor's degree in natural resources from NC State and a master's in public health from the University of South Florida. And I'm so grateful that I get to work at this intersection of health and the environment with the center. My job today is to welcome you all, share some housekeeping items, and introduce our moderator and panelists. I want to note that I'm based in Jacksonville, Florida, which is stolen Seminole, Timucua, and Muscogee land. Many individuals face displacement and suffering, and I hope one day they receive restorative measures. So let me introduce our moderator and panelists. First, we have Nandita Bajaj, is the Executive Director of Population Balance, which is a U.S. nonprofit that works to inspire narrative, behavioral, and system change that shrinks human impact and elevates the rights and well-being of people, animals, and the planet. She produces and hosts and co-hosts two podcasts. One is Overshoot, in which my center colleagues, Tiara and Stephanie, just participated in, so make sure you get that one in your feed, and Beyond Pronatalism, which is how she helped us bring these panelists together. So if you've ever wanted to talk back to a podcast, this is your opportunity. She's delivered over 100 presentations globally, and she's a senior lecturer at Antioch University, where she teaches courses on ecological ethics, pronatalism, and overshoot. Then we have Molly Peacock, whose memoir about her choice to be child-free called Paradise, Piece by Piece was published in 1998, and she's been receiving mail about it ever since. And I got to tell you, Molly, I actually got this book for myself in like 2005 and have shared it with others. So it's really an honor to meet you. Next, we have Juliana Barberi, is a Colombia-based activist and educator with degrees in biomedical engineering and sustainable development. She's been the director of Raya, an animal protection nonprofit, for over 2 decades. She also directs and co-hosts 2 podcasts on planetary health and animal rights and teaches. Finally, we have Sherifa Awudu, is a knowledge management and sexual and reproductive health and rights specialist, inclusion advocate, and digital innovation enthusiast, with 10 years of international experience working within the global health space. Her work focuses on digital advocacy and reproductive justice for young people, women, and girls. Such important work. Thank you so much. She's currently a PhD candidate at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Welcome all. Thank you so much. Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you so much, Kelley, for that great introduction and for this wonderful collaboration. Population Balance is thrilled to partner with the Center for Biological Diversity for this incredible webinar. As Kelley said, welcome all, and thank you so much for being here at a time when threats to reproductive rights and planetary health are accelerating under increasingly authoritarian global leadership. Coming together to stand up against these forces is one of the most effective antidotes. And today's webinar tackles one of the core ideologies that is causing these issues. And this ideology has plagued us, especially women, for millennia, and that is pronatalism, the societal pressures to have children. And before I start the discussion, a little bit about me. I'm Nandita. I'm almost 45 years old. I live in Toronto with my husband, Mike, and our dog, Sophie, who's the center of our universe. I'd like to say a few words about my own awakening to pronatalism over 15 years ago. I was born and raised in India and moved to Canada with my family when I was 17. And despite the rigid patriarchal norms, my parents raised me with progressive values. In my late 20s, I met my now husband, Mike, and as we were becoming serious in our relationship, the question about children came up. Specifically, he asked me, "What are your thoughts on having or not having kids?" I was so confused and I was like, what do you mean? Don't we have to? He smiled and said, of course not. That's a decision we make together. And I'm like, what? I'm literally experiencing two very conflicting emotions. One is pure joy that I could choose to not have children, which was overwhelmingly liberating. It's not something I had imagined growing up, but something that I thought was just going to happen. And the other emotion I was having was shock that I, a feminist, an aerospace engineer at the time, and a seemingly independent thinker, didn't know until I was almost 28 that I even had the choice. How is that possible? And my response then was, are you serious? Can we not have kids? It didn't take us long to decide that we wouldn't have children. It actually aligned with a lot of our other values around environmentalism and minimalism. But that conversation was a pivotal moment that changed the direction of my life forever. Why did I think that motherhood was an inevitability? And how many others were there who, like me, didn't know they had a choice? And was it a coincidence that nation states with rigid patriarchal norms also had the highest fertility rates? Those questions stayed with me for over a decade, and I eventually went back to school to do my master's degree, looking at the connections between pronatalism, population, and planetary health. And my research showed me that pronatalism is indeed the oldest form of reproductive control that prevents us from making liberated and responsible reproductive choices. Whether it's the parental pressures for grandchildren, whether it's the religious teachings that treat parenthood as an obligation, or the political pressures for more laborers, taxpayers, consumers, or soldiers. I have now dedicated my life to exposing how pronatalism is connected to reproductive injustice, population pressures, and ecological degradation. I'm proud to say that Population Balance is a leading organization making these connections, and that I teach the only graduate course of its kind at Antioch University that is offered online and is open to anyone. And it is really through my work that I've come to meet incredible people like our panelists today, Juliana, Molly, and Sherifa, all of whom were recently on my Beyond Pronatalism podcast to share their personal stories. With that, I'm going to turn over our attention to our panelists who represent different geographies, cultures, and ages, and they will enlighten us with their own stories on how they are navigating pronatalism in their own lives and redefining fulfillment, meaning, and community beyond these harmful narratives. So we'll do brief introductions first, and we'll start with you, Sherifa. If you can briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Amsterdam. As Kelley already introduced me, my name is Sherifa Awudu. I'm currently based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but originally I am Ghanaian. By profession, I work as an SRH, sexual and reproductive health and rights specialist, but with my experience mainly within the African context. I am also currently a PhD candidate at Leiden University, studying the socio-legal context of abortion within Ghana's statutory framework and its implication on reproductive justice, health service delivery, childbearing patterns, and generally the evolving fertility trends in Ghana and then in Africa. On a personal note, I am 31 years old, currently partnered, but by choice, I do not have children. It is, however, important for me to just state that it is a possibility that is we are open to, depending on what we decide at the long run. For me, similar to Nandita, pronatalism, it has always been present long before I could put a name or a title or a terminology to it. What I share in similarity with Nandita is I come from a community where it's patriarchal and very religious, but I also grew up with a lot of strong support systems that also was able to have conversations around childbearing and some of the gendered norms. So for me, it was present. I just did not know that there was a title for it. And from there on, it has from my teenage years as a volunteer with different organizations. It has been present. And the older I get, the more present it shows or it becomes both in my personal life and in my professional space. So yeah, that is a brief introduction about me, and I'll hand it back to you, Nandita.
Thank you so much, Sherifa. Lovely. Juliana, how about you?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Nandita and Kelley, and many thanks to Population Balance and the Center for Biological Diversity for this panel. My name is Juliana. I live in Medellin, Colombia, where I was born. I'm 44 years old, almost 45. I work as a college professor at two different universities here in Medellin, where I teach animal law and critical animal studies and environmental issues. I am also the director of an organization called Raja. It's an animal rights organization, and I am an activist for animals and the planet. I host a podcast called Ojos del Bosque, and I raise awareness about the equal social crisis. And I decided not to have children in my 20s, despite having been raised in a conservative country where motherhood or reproduction is considered sacred, and where even from the Catholic school I attended, they presented motherhood as one of the necessary paths for a woman. Although, on the other hand, they demonized sex. So I always found that quite inconsistent. And I remained single for 14 years, but a couple of months ago, I started a relationship with someone who, like me, and decided not to have children because of the state of the world, like the state of nature and the environment. I believe that the experience of motherhood is necessary, especially when someone else's life is at risk, the baby, the children. So all my decisions have revolved around being mindful of our impact on the planet. I am also vegan. I consume as little as possible, and I try to stay true to my values and beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Wonderful. Molly.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. It was such a joy to be on the podcast with Nandita, and it's wonderful to hear Juliana and Sherifa's stories of their lives and introductions. I am 79. I made the choice not to have children many, many times in my life, beginning at the age of 4. I am a poet and a biographer. I am a widow. I believe above all that there are so many ways to love. That loving as a mother is one among them. And I have experienced so many ways to love. When I was a child growing up in the 1950s, life was very different for me. I grew up in a working class family outside of Buffalo, New York. But I had a mother who, though she wasn't educated, was a reader, very thoughtful. And this scene when I was 4 years old is in my memoir, Paradise Piece by Piece. And thank you so much, Kelley, for mentioning that you bought this book in this century, since it was published in the last century and is still going on. In Paradise Piece by Piece, I describe being 4 in our little kitchen. My mother's at the stove. My father has come in drunk in his work boots and his work clothes. My sister is zooming this wheel toy across the linoleum. My grandmother's in the doorway, and it's rackety and not calm in any way. And my grandmother actually says, "Don't ever have children, Molly." And my father says, "Yeah, don't ever have kids." And my mother turns from the stove and looks at me and says, "You can do anything you want." That was not what she could do. She could not do anything she wanted. And so at various times in my life, which I'll describe later, I kept remaking this decision.
Amazing. Thank you to all of you for these beautiful introductions, even though I've had the privilege of meeting you and interviewing you for these personal stories on the podcast. Every time I listen to your stories, it's just always so compelling and powerful. And so we'll go to our next question, which is directly about pronatalism, something you've all touched on a little bit. So pronatalism shows up in a number of ways across cultures, and we here represent different geographies, different upbringings, different cultures. Growing up, what were the expectations from family and culture, specifically for you, around gender roles, marriage, and children?
Well, I could continue on from what I just said. Going back to that kitchen in 1951, it was very unusual for the working class people around me not to have children, even though it was drummed into me, even at that age, that you weren't supposed to, quote unquote, make a mistake and end up as a quote unquote unwed mother. So what Juliana said about that sex is forbidden, but you're supposed to have a family, all of that, those contradictions were very present. And the pronatalism was simply an assumption. It was an assumption that everyone shared. And a question like, if someone didn't have children, they were a curiosity, and the whispered questions about what happened, who couldn't, somehow something in that person's life, biology, etc., prevented them. At the same time, there were the seeds of feminism that were going to burst forth after those, what are called in the United States, Eisenhower years, those post-war years. And the World War II promoted that kind of image, pronatalist image of women like my mother, who had to give up their jobs and go back and become a Leave It to Beaver mom, if for those of you who remember a television show like that. So it wasn't like a special edict, dictum. It was deep, deep into every thread of the tapestry of society.
Beautifully captured, Molly. That's exactly what it feels like, the water that we're swimming in. Sherifa, how about for you?
Yeah, I can also continue. Thank you very much, Molly. And as much as I am not as old, but I think I relate to it a lot, listening to some of the stories that my aunties, my grandmas, grandparents would usually also tell us. But before I answer, I want to paint a little bit of a picture, adding some color to my background. I am a Muslim woman, one, and I come from a family that is deeply religious and also patriarchal. That also applies to the part of Ghana that I come from, which is the northern region of Ghana, is highly religious and patriarchal. To add more colors, I'm a firstborn daughter and I am a firstborn granddaughter. So now with this beautifully painted background, the general expectation for women is to get married after school. That's if you're lucky to be in school, to be able to finish school, and then start a family as soon as you can. The conversation is usually not, when do I want to have children, but it's the moment you're married, the expectation is you need to start popping out those children as soon as you can. So to understand, it's even not frowned upon entirely when you have children before you're done with school, or what we would say out of wedlock. Of course, there's going to be gossip, oh, you did not finish school, or you got children out of wedlock. But after that, there is some kind of glamour that comes with having children, to the point where it's not as frowned upon as the society makes it look like, because there is a child in the picture, and a child is something that we should all welcome. Of course, children are beautiful, and being a mother for some people is very important, but then it takes away the cultural relevance of saying no children out of wedlock or no sex before marriage and all that conversation. In the same light, there's also, the earlier you have children as a woman, the earlier you get to rest from having to be pregnant. So people want to have children early so they can be free from having children, because at a certain point in your life as a woman, you are not able to have children and all of that. The other dimension is the number of children is also rarely a topic for discussion. How many children you want to have is usually more on, just have as many as you can. I've had people tell me, in fact, my family members tell me, my aunties tell me, oh, you know what, don't put a limit on children, the number of children you want to have. After I said, I think if I want to have children, I want to have a maximum of 2 children. And then the question comes, what if they die? So the idea is to have more children. So if there's a disaster or something happens and 1 or 2 children dies, you still have some left. And then for me, it's a conversation that is flawed by a lot of things, culturally and then also religiously. And then the conversation of not having children based on the number of children you can take care of. But then the saying also where I come from, like, just have children, God will take care of the children, which really does not make sense if you look at it in that side. So in a bigger picture also, there is a pattern of mothers, the health of mothers not always prioritized the moment the baby arrives. So the conversation moves from, oh, you're still a pregnant woman, when are you going to have children, to, oh, how is the baby, and never how is the health of the mother. And we all know what postpartum depression looks like. New mothers struggle a lot, old mothers struggle a lot. Having a child generally is a very heavy burden on the health, the total health of the mother. So for me, these are some of the cultural norms, things that have been normalized so much within where I come from, that makes me really question the conversation of, is childbearing really relevant? Because at the end of the day, all these assumptions are flawed by the assumption that the woman is the homemaker. As a woman, you have to figure everything out. A mother, a wife, a sister-in-law, a daughter-in-law, there's always that title that comes with being a woman that basically domesticates you whether you want to or not. And the sad part of it is that you are technically not also considered family at the end of the day, because you do not share blood with your husband or your partner's family and even your children. So at the long run, you are still considered an outsider. So for me, these are some of the way pronatalism shows up for me, like in day-to-day life. I could look at it from a structural, more complex conversation, but then I think the more closer it is to home, the more glaring it is in your face that you can actually see it. And it's sad that you see these patterns from the eras of my grandparents repeating itself and then taking different shapes and different forms in the era of my aunties and my mom, and also in my generation, and then in the generation that is after, the Gen Zs and Gen Alphas. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Sherifa. There's so much to unpack there. And I'll invite the audience again, because we won't get to the depth of all the stories of at least these 3 panelists and all the dozens of other stories, to listen to the episodes, to really learn in depth these stories. Juliana, how about for you?
Well, I don't know if I have to clarify this, but everything I say is based on my own personal experience, and that my situation and opinions will certainly not reflect those of everyone. So I had the advantage or disadvantage of coming from a family that was not so careful or particularly attentive when it came to raising me. So from my family, I didn't feel that pressure, aside from the occasional mention here and there about grandkids. But even my grandmother congratulated me when I told her I didn't want to get married or I didn't want to have children, because she told me she wished she'd had that opportunity. And the situation, of course, is different at school and in society. And from a very young age, we are taught that motherhood is an inevitable path. I remember that the religious school where I studied, some of my classmates got pregnant before graduating. And although it was like a scandal of biblical proportions, the others congratulated them on that big step. Like, congratulations, you're a mom. And I always found that very strange. And I didn't see what there was to celebrate. They were just girls giving birth to children. They were not prepared. And now, as it was expected, many of them have one or more children. But what stands out to me is that many more decided not to have children. And I think that proportion is unprecedented in history. So many women decided, despite the constant propaganda, the pronatalist propaganda promoting motherhood, not to have children. And what is very clear, though, is that there is a constant pressure not to remain single. That's always been there. I think is one of the hardest things to overcome. When I was voluntarily single for 40 years, people constantly asked me why I was doing it. Like, they made inappropriate comments about my sexuality, told me I was going to meet some kind of boat, and said I was wasting myself. I think we're still very attached to the idea of a traditional family with a dad, mom, kids, and we refuse to see other valuable ways of creating caring communities, not just for humans, but for animals, plants, ecosystems, water, air, mountains. And I think the world right now, especially right now, needs more people willing to care.
Beautifully said, Juliana. Thank you for that. As all of you have captured in your stories, there is so much injustice built into pronatalism. It's not just the subtle pressures here and there from family. It really is a deep source of coercion and injustice for young girls, for women, and for the children who are born out of these coercive pressures. And as Sherifa said, parenthood can be a beautiful journey when allowed to be chosen consciously. But the question remains, how many of us are allowed that choice, to have the privilege of that choice? So I'll move on to the next question, and all of you have touched on it briefly, is given the water of pronatalism that you were swimming within, some of you, it was very strong, some of you, it was relatively weak. How did your path diverge? And some of you already spoken to that, from the one that was laid out for you by culture and family. And as you were navigating that path, did you experience pushback? How did you manage that pushback? What kind of things did you have to say to respond to that? And Juliana, you can continue on.
Okay. So as I was saying, many people around me have voluntarily decided not to have children, and that is a decision made very consciously. Like, we think a lot about this, like, why don't we have kids? Should we have kids and all that? So it is not a decision that we take lightly. And it's even more special considering that society pressures us to have children. We have political systems that reward reproduction. These political systems are driven by economic models of infinite growth that, in addition to being unsustainable, require more and more people to consume and become cheap labor and part of the army. So everything under that influence, the media, even laws, education, amplifies the message of reproduction, because I don't think it is always about motherhood, because there are countless ways to be a parent that don't require reproduction. So another factor comes into play, the religion issue. And Colombia is a Catholic country now with a Christian leaning, like all countries where the far right is gaining ground. And religion contributes very negatively to promoting narratives that work against reproductive rights. That's what I see here in Colombia. And when I made that decision, I went against all of this. But I should also clarify that I am an atheist. I am an apostate. I think that's the right pronunciation of the word. I renounced religion, and freeing myself from that spiritual obligation made it easier for me to make these decisions, because I didn't have to ask anyone for permission. So I have the advantage or disadvantage again of being very critical of everything and questioning everything and not letting myself be influenced by other people's beliefs. So any pushback I got would be met with firm, informed stances of my decisions. As I told you, I thought about this for a long time. And I don't think it's my duty, my path, my destiny, or much less my right to bring children into a world that's falling apart. And I don't think it's fair to the children, and I don't think it's fair to the planet and to everyone that lives inside the planet.
Really well said, Juliana. And I think to your point, whenever we talk, even within reproductive rights and sexual health and rights discourse, I think the point about the rights of children and their well-being is often not considered. We're still so far away from achieving reproductive autonomy for people, especially women, that we have not gone to that point yet. But I think that needs to be totally interconnected, is the rights of children to be born into situations that are conducive to their well-being and to be able to make that decision responsibly. Molly, what was your experience with navigating this?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how thrilling it is to hear Juliana and Sherifa speaking about their lives and choices, and that I connect with much of what they say, although I am almost half a century older than they are. So let's peel back to the 1960s. I'm one of the first, I mean, part of the first generation in North America, at any rate, to benefit from birth control and birth control pills. So I began feeling that I had a choice, as my mother slightly instigated, but as the rest of my culture did not reaffirm. I began feeling that I had a choice in the 1960s, and to feel that you have a choice is so empowering. It can charge your energy enough to then make another choice and another choice. Concomitant with my childhood feeling that I did not want to become a mother was the acknowledgement that I was gifted. And also, so people were saying, oh, she's so creative. What a creative little girl she is. And I thought, yes, okay, I'm creative. Well, what happens to a creative girl who is not from an educated family? There were no books in my household except Popular Mechanics and the Bible. So when I got to college, to university, I began writing poetry seriously for the first time, although I had written since I was 10. And I had a grandmother who was a daily diarist, and I saw a writing practice, but I never connected that with making art. And as I began to study, I realized that I could do this, and I loved writing poetry, and I loved writing in general. But I had there were no models. There was no way to follow this path. I was constantly inventing it. But just those feelings that I had a choice allowed me to start to go forward, even though there was nobody else who would pop up and say, hi, I want to be a poet. And I couldn't say that myself. There would be young men who swagger into a party and say, hi, I'm a poet. And I would think, you can say that? All right, those are the same guys who would say, hi, I want to have my baby. It's all of those things I had to push back against, but I realized that every single choice I was making was leading me further and further under one side of the bell curve. I'm like in 1% of the people down there. And how was I going to go on? So it was a kind of, my choices got made and remade as I would face, well, okay, you're graduating now. aren't you supposed to get married and have children? And then I would have to make the choice again. And okay, I finally began writing and publishing. Is there a way for you to even make a living doing this? So all of the economic issues came in on me, trying to find a way to make my way in the world. And I just want to say one word about grandmothers, because my grandmother was a secret writer, a domestic writer, but also it was my grandmother who said, "Don't ever have children, Molly." And the life experience of older women as they've been able to, often one-to-one, just influence younger women is another secret thread, because for me, again, these issues are deeply psychological and they are at the heart of a person's character.
Amazing, Molly. That journey of like having to decide over and over again that you were not going to be a mother. It also just shows you, especially as women, that we spend almost half of our lives trying to not be pregnant and trying to control our fertility or trying to make that decision and be anxious about, is now the time, not the time, who with, how many, etc. And so your point also about how the idea of pronatalism from such a young age actually stunts our imagination of who we might imagine ourselves to be when we grow up. So like your idea of being a poet and guys feeling relatively comfortable thinking that, you know, their choices are open and infinite versus so many of us thinking that we have to work around our responsibility, which I think the way society has built it falls primarily on mothers. So that's, I think for people who are parents, that is the kind of a systemic injustice where we cannot imagine our lives, you know, unless they are hugely divided between parenting and our aspirations. Thank you for that. Sherifa, over to you. How did you navigate these pressures?
Thank you very much. I feel a lot of similarities across all three of us, especially with Juliana, when you mentioned about questioning. So for me, my path definitely was influenced by asking questions. Of course, my field of work contributed considerably to how I asked my questions, where I asked my questions, and then how I was able to analyze some of these discourses and trends, and ultimately asking, who does this serve? So at the end of the day, if we are having children, who does having children serve? Like, what's the purpose in the bigger picture? I mentioned earlier on about having a very good support system within my family. I'm lucky to have quite a number of progressive men within my family that was really helpful in navigating and pursuing my studies and not having that pressure of get married. At what point some of my colleagues or some of my friends, childhood friends, have had to face that kind of pressure of getting married and starting families. I never had that. For that, I'm very grateful. And again, that is definitely a thing of privilege that I recognize that does not cut across for every woman in the world. There is also a very nice trick that I have about asking very uncomfortable questions to people when they try to query some of my life decisions. So typically, in my context, certain conversations are not conversations you talk about out loud. There are expectations. You're just born as a woman. It's supposed to be a natural instinct. And when you start asking certain questions, they're like, what's wrong? And then also there's a conversation of, oh, wait, you're talking like a white woman, you're talking like a Westerner, all these work that you're doing is taking away the culture out of you, which is not the case, because even within traditional African communities, traditional African religion, societies, there were conversations of pronatalism that is actually quite ingrained. And family planning, traditional contraceptive family planning have existed in African traditional societies for millennia, for years, for centuries. So it is not foreign, but by virtue of the fact that this is a conversation and now there is an English word for it, there is that kind of a pushback. So of course, when there's a question about, oh, if you don't have children now, who will take care of you when you are old? And then my question is, what's the guarantee that I will live to be old? There is no guarantee. And if I should have children now, because you want me to have children, and then I die before the child turns, say, 15 or 10, who is going to take care of this child per se? So some of these conversations are quite uncomfortable conversations because we know death exists, but we do not treat death as part of our plans as we live on. There's also the thing about, oh, why would I want to have the expectation that having children will mean they will take care of me in future? There is no guarantee. You can have as many children as you want, and then all children can die, or all children can decide to cut contact. We've seen that happening in a lot of cultures. That does not typically happen in my culture, but then it is possible. There is that possibility. So of course, these are questions that I know are very uncomfortable, especially for the older generation. So you just give it to them, and then you're able to weasel your way out of the conversation. One other thing that I think is very important for me to mention is grounding myself in knowledge that serves me and people like me, and also gaining different forms of freedom. So I am a Muslim woman, and gaining enough knowledge in your religion to know that even the religion tells you to not have children that you cannot care for is a very good arguing point when these conversations come from a religious perspective. I grounded myself in enough knowledge to be able to make arguments and have these conversations when people ask me or query, or like there's a general conversation within my peers or within spaces that I find myself. More importantly, again, this is a thing of privilege, and I just want to highlight that it is not it does not apply to everybody. Gaining some form of freedom, if possible, all forms of freedom. I'm talking financial, geographical, emotional also. So you're able to guard yourself from the blackmail, the guilt tripping of why you don't want to be a mother. I have never said I do not want to be a mother, but by virtue of the fact that I am currently not a mother, there's a lot of guilt tripping that goes around these conversations. Having financial freedom also allows you a lot of leeway to be grounded in the decisions that you make about yourself. Geographical freedom or geographical advantage. I have that geographical advantage. I live very far from my family. So out of sight, out of mind. When the conversations come, I get to choose when I want to answer or when I don't want to answer. And then when I go home and they see me, they're most of the time too happy to think about other things. So it's like not primary on their list of topics they want to discuss with me. So I think these are some of the ways that for me helped me diverge helped me create this path that I am on away from the societal expectations on what I should do with myself, what I should do with my uterus, and among other things. So yeah, over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Sherifa. Great advice on arming yourself with knowledge, especially within the religious context that you're in. So one final question for each of the panelists specific to your lives. Juliana, we're going to start with you. One of the common tropes that people without children are charged with is that they are selfish. We obviously know that's not true, and yet we have to continue to debunk these narratives, which have their roots in patriarchy and religion, etc. What has being child-free enabled you to do, and how do you find fulfillment?
Okay, so I have to warn you, the avocado guy is screaming in the street, so I'm sorry for that. I apologize. So
we can't hear him.
Yes, many people, when they find out that some women or people don't want to have children, they immediately label them as selfish because they believe that bringing children into a world like this, it's a very selfless act. I completely disagree, and I think it could be the opposite. I think people who want to have children should reflect on the reasons for having them. And I think they'll realize that some of those reasons revolve around themselves, not around children, which is something we already discussed, who haven't been born yet. So I believe that is not true, and sometimes it's quite the opposite. For me, not having children is first and foremost a very selfless act because I love my children so much that I cannot bring them into a world like this. I just can't. I cannot do that harm to them. And I wouldn't be able to live with the thought that my children will face a future as chaotic as the one that lies ahead. Like I couldn't live with that. And not having children, on the other hand, has allowed me to dedicate myself to activism for animals, for the planet, for the world we share, and for the well-being of all of us who inhabited it. And that wouldn't have been possible if I had obligations such as those related to raising children. So there are many paths through which one can care for others, nurture, lead, guide, and build communities and family. And I don't know where I find fulfillment. The truth is that I do all my activism out of necessity or fear, if you want, because I'm not the kind of person who stands idly by while everything falls apart. And I like to help, I like to contribute to society, and that's what I've been dedicating my life to. So, do I find fulfillment there? I couldn't say. How could I find it when I'm confronted every day with indifference, the destruction of nature and animals, and a lot of suffering? And I know I'm getting into a very philosophical line of thought here, but I don't know if what I do gives me fulfillment or simply makes me at peace with who I am and with wanting to make things better instead of choosing to make them worse or being indifferent, which is something we are currently seeing in the world.
Juliana, that's a very beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people in our audience can relate to that, how many of us have dedicated our lives to minimize suffering. And it's not always in an effort to bring us joy or peace, although that often is a side effect of helping others. Sherifa, you mentioned earlier that you are still ambivalent about your decision about having children. And our culture has a very difficult time accepting ambivalence around parenthood as a legitimate response. We are compelled to believe that those who have children will never regret the choice, and those who don't have children will definitely regret that choice. What questions are you considering as you navigate this decision?
So like there's that conversation, and there's a bigger question on adoption. Do you really have to have a child to be able to feel that motherly love? And the question then is, will I regret it if I don't have children, or will I regret it if I have children? I don't have children, but I am taking care of people that are not my children, and I sort of regret having those children. So the bigger conversation is, if I want to start again from scratch, inception, all the way to labor, then infancy, then all the way to it's a very big question, and these are very important for me to consider in the direction I want my life to go towards. I am still open to the possibility of having children, depending on the answers that I eventually have to the questions that I have. And of course, still piggybacking on Molly's statements, there are so many children in the world that wish to have love. If there are people that really, really want to have children, there are many children that need to be adopted. And that is definitely an option. And that is why I love the work that I do, having these conversations at grassroots levels, regional levels, even within policy spaces on the importance of choice for women to decide when they want to, how they want to, if they want to, is very important. Access to maternal health care is equally important. And by maternal health care, that does not exclude abortion services. If women have access to safe abortion services, is equally as important to women having access to safe delivery services. And generally, reproductive health justice is very core to the conversation of pronatalism. And yeah, the health generally, the joy of motherhood is not only on the benefit of having a child, but also having a fully functional and healthy mother. The whole concept of motherhood being seen as baby making machinery or like a system of producing, the biblical terms would say go and multiply in the world, I think it can be translated in a lot of ways. I don't have any background in theology, but I'm sure if we should unpack that, there will be a lot of ways we can multiply and share love across the world. And of course, through the work that I do try to have these conversations at any opportunity that I get to say, hey, like Juliana said, the world is already falling apart. We do not need to be part of breaking down systems. Women are part of the system that make the world work. And obviously, there has to be some level of priority to the health and general well-being of women who also choose to not have children. So yeah, that'll be it for me. Thank you, Nandita.
Thank you so much, Sherifa. Really, really exemplary answer, especially in showing what are the kinds of questions people should be considering and investigating for themselves as they decide on their own reproductive choices. Molly, there's a reason I saved this one for last. You are the most experienced of us in navigating these pressures. In fact, you've already said you've been making the choice to not have children many, many times in your life. You've experienced pronatalism at every stage of your life. Two common fear-based tropes almost all child-free people encounter are, you'll never know what true love is until you've had a child. And another one is, who will take care of you when you're old, both of which have been touched on briefly. Your life debunks these tropes beautifully. Can you say a few words about these?
It's very true that people, of course, say you'll never know what love is like until you've had a child. And my response to that is, surely you have loved another person. And I speak from the experience of having known my late husband since we were teenagers, from a 28-year thriving marriage where we both decided, we got married in midlife, even though we knew each other a long time, that we would not have children, that we would have a family of two that somehow feels big. Committed, loving relationships grow and have a largeness to them. And that means love for all kinds of things in this world, all kinds of people, all kinds of endeavors. I'm going to repeat again that there are so many ways to love, so many kinds of love. And as far as who's going to take care of me when I'm old, I have to say, when I was young and made this decision, I thought, I can't wait. Am I making a decision when I'm 25 about what's going to happen to me when I'm 79? I can't wrap my head around it. And as Sherifa said, so many people live far away from their parents. They are unable to make these decisions. And psychologically, there are so many rifts and so many interfering decisions that I also see as children feel that they have the corner on what should be their parents' decisions. I have had many loving relationships, and the people who hold my powers of attorney are two younger women who have been students in my life and who've stepped up to help make those end of life decisions for me. And I'm very grateful to be able to love them and for them to be able to take on that responsibility. But it's choice upon choice upon choice upon choice. That's how you build a life. And you get happier as you age, as sociologists affirm, and also as Ingrid Kanitas, the sociologist who conducted research among aging people, did they have regrets that they did not have children? Uniformly, no.
Excellent. Excellent, Molly. And I think that is really amazing advice in terms of how we build our own, not only legacy, but also care in our old age. And if we really do start thinking about it early, as many people who don't have children do, there are many different ways in which we can build those communities around us. I'm actually going to move on to the questions because there's a question about that. Amy says, as a person who is committed to reproductive justice, but also painfully aware of the impact that each new baby I see my friends and family will have on the planet, and knowing that that impact is exorbitantly higher than anywhere else because I'm in the US, I struggle to reconcile my commitment to reproductive autonomy with climate protection. I'd love to hear how the panelists work through these issues for themselves. Juliana, you've talked a lot about reproductive responsibility today and the rights of children and also the environment. Would you like to answer it?
Yes, sure. I also worry a lot about the climate. Like I teach climate change and all of other ecological situations we are dealing right now. And that's the reason I decided not to have children, because I don't want the children to go over that. And I think reproductive autonomy is focusing on the rights to decide whether you want to have children or not. And I think we have to start focusing more on the rights of the not yet born, like those children that are not born yet. Do we have the right to bring them into a world where maybe they won't have a chance, or they won't have the opportunity to live a fulfilling life? And we've been seeing the acceleration of all of the environmental problems and the rise of fascism and all of these situations that make us feel so hopeless. And I think we should start thinking if their kids deserve that. Like, do our kids deserve to be brought to a world that it's collapsing and they will have to probably fight over water and food, and they will have to see the collapse of the economic system with all the suffering that will bring? And I focus a lot about the children because I'm a very maternal person. I take care of everyone and I love everyone and I want everyone to have happiness, and I worried about people that I don't even know. Like, but my focus is on my children, not on me. It doesn't matter if I want, it doesn't matter if I don't want. What I ask is, does the child, or will the child have a great life in this world? And increasing our population is part of the causes that are causing the collapse of our system, of our living system. And I mean, if you care about climate change or the state of the planet, then you have to ask yourself, do I have the right to bring more children into our world? I'm not saying you shouldn't have children, but maybe change the focus of the question that you are asking yourself if you're thinking about having or not having children.
Wonderful. Very thoughtful response, Juliana. Thank you so much. There are two questions that are quite related. Both of them are asking, what will it take to establish the support system needed to empower women to remain child-free, especially for older, single, or widowed women, and especially when there's not an obvious caregiver in old age, especially in countries with there's no Medicare or Social Security system built for elderly people. What are things that we can be thinking about as a society, as a community, and as individuals? Molly or Sherifa?
Well, I can't answer that question except from my own North American point of view. It has been an issue for me for decades. I'm always looking to connect with people, to connect with ideas. Oh, I hear there's a group of women who bought a house so that they could all age together, etc. I'm endlessly checking out retirement home situations that I could possibly go into. I live alone, and I've made the decision to keep living alone as long as I possibly can. But I'm also in a large building with a community of people, and I participate in the activities of my building and of other activities so that I keep making connections to people. It's the best way I have of being a neighbor, pitching in with other people, taking care of other people, receiving that care from them. Sometimes I am extremely alone. And when I'm sick and alone, I can panic. I can't sugarcoat that. But at the same time, all my other choices have given me this very rich and fruitful life. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm in pain, I just say, okay, Molly Peacock, you've made a lot of these choices. There are people out there. And when you wake up and it's 8 o'clock in the morning, not 5 o'clock in the morning, you've got the imagination to figure this out. Now, that's a very personal answer, but there are also societal answers that we can all keep working on as we allow these ideas of pronatalism to surface, and as we discuss them, it gives room for other ideas to appear. And there's a little word that I'd like to inject into this conversation that Juliana said. She said, I don't want it to be hopeless. And so let's just take that little word hope. These are hopeful stories that you've heard today. These are hopeful situations and hopeful ideas. And I believe in that hope as much as I believe in the varieties of love.
Really, really well said, Molly. Final thoughts, Sherifa?
Yes. First of all, I want to just declare that this is a very personal reflection based on the question that's being asked. Where I come from, retirement homes do not exist. Matter of fact, if you're a woman aged with no children, probably not married, you are probably going to be accused of being a witch and taken to a witch camp. So that is the unfortunate realities of women who even have children and are married. So then it's probably going to be compounded if you are not married and you do not have children, if it's a decision you made in your youthful age to stay child-free. However, I believe that in this era, or at least in my demographic, women who will decide and make the choice to not have children can be encouraged to properly plan for when they are older. We do not have these conversations because within this context, it is not understood. And by virtue of it not being understood, there are no systems that will support older women who do not have people to take care of them. Unless, of course, you have a strongly knit extended family system that will still help you maintain a relationship, because families typically live in extended family homes. So in one house, you have the grandparents, the aunties, everybody lives in the house. It's a lot easier if you live in this kind of a system. Otherwise, there is really no structure. However, it is important to also encourage women who are yet to age, who make these decisions, to consciously make build friendships and relationships that would benefit them during that time when the time comes, and then also responsibly make plans for it. Of course, this is when, if all things are equal and nothing happens, I saw in the comments where people are losing their loved ones and then they feel completely alone. These are things that we cannot anticipate, we cannot plan against, but yeah, I think there's a degree to what you can also do in preparation for if you outlive your friendship group in that sense. Again, I am not at that age, so I can't really give a concrete example based on experience, but this is my reflection. If I am in that position, this is what I would do. And finally, it is important that for people like me who work within policy spaces and government spaces to actually push for age-sensitive policy and interventions at national level and also regional levels, that these conversations appear in our laws, appear in our policy rooms, to see how, in what ways might we be able to make space for women who willingly or unwillingly end up growing old and not having children. And I think these are some of the reflections that I can share in accordance to that question.
Thank you so much, Sherifa. Very, very insightful comments. There's one last question, and if all the panelists don't mind, I'd love to answer it because it's a question that's near and dear to my heart. So we have a question from Mary Pat. How do we make a distinction between what we are talking about on our panel and the concept of antinatalism, which I find to be a common confusion? This is a subject that I address very deeply in my own work, population balance, and in my own teaching at Antioch University. Often people think that when we are challenging an ideology as deep and pervasive and coercive as pronatalism, the conclusion is that we are advocating antinatalism. Antinatalism being another philosophy or ideology that sees having kids as unethical under any circumstance, that considers life generally to be full of suffering and hardships, and that to be born is seen as an unethical behavior. Some antinatalists are conditional antinatalists, to not have children during times like these, while others believe that being alive in and of itself is a negative thing. In my own work, we reject the concept or philosophy or ideology of antinatalism. I'm very much committed to reproductive justice principles, where we advance reproductive autonomy, given the fact that majority of the people around the world do not have that. And at the same time, we also advocate reproductive responsibility, that those with the privilege of choice, the kind of panel that we've had today, are making that decision deeply, carefully, thoughtfully, and responsibly, considering the rights of the child that they potentially might bring into the world, but also, as Juliana spoke today, the rights of everyone else who already exists today who could really use our time and resources to help minimize their suffering. And so what does it mean to balance reproductive autonomy with responsibility is a question that each one of us has to investigate in our own lives, rather than a prescriptive thing of you have kids, from pronatalism, or don't have kids from antinatalism. Both of them, I believe, undermine reproductive autonomy, which, as I've said, majority of the people around the world, especially women, do not have. I am going to now pass it over to Kelley to close it off. Thank you to our amazing panelists for this great discussion. Over to you, Kelley.
This was such a rich and wonderful discussion. I want to thank Nandita for pulling this great panel together and moderating it with such empathy and care. And a big thanks to all of our panelists for sharing your story and time, because these are definitely personal things. And thanks to you for watching. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and take care.